So we appreciate you coming. Grab a calendar, grab some flyers on the way out when you walk out today, because everybody leaves at the end. So, and I want to introduce quickly our speakers and let them introduce themselves, but we want to thank Amy, Blaymore, Paterson, and Keri, Enright-Kato.
Long names.
Yeah, long names. Make sure I got that right. For spending their weeknight after with us and giving us a talk on climate change and land trust. So I'll let them give you their background, and I'll give her a hand for Keri and Amy.
Okay, let's see if I can manage notes, computer, water, all of this, microphone. Okay, so I'm Keri Enright-Kato. I am the director of the Office of Climate Change at Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. A little bit about my background. Hello, Mark. I actually worked with towns across the state of Connecticut. I guess about more than 10 years ago, helped creating the Clean Energy Task Force and the 20% by 2010 Clean Energy campaign. So maybe there's some familiar faces from back then. So it's great to be out here tonight. Tonight I'm talking about climate change, not so much about clean energy or energy technologies. Let's see. So I'll just give you, hopefully most of you are familiar with DEEP. I'll just give you a quick overview of our structure and talk a little bit about my office and what my office does. So we were established in 2011. It was taking together the Department of Environmental Protection, along with the Department of Public Utility Control, and the energy offices in the Office of Policy and Management. So it's unique in that most states have two separate offices. They have the Department of Energy and they have their Department of Environment. So it's really bringing together your energy and environmental goals into one agency. So the structure, we have our energy branch, our environmental quality branch, environmental conservation branch, and the Office of the Commissioner. I assume that many of you work with the Office of the Environmental Conservation branch. My office is actually in the energy branch. 80%, 85% of Connecticut's emissions sit in the energy sector, but I do work across the agency with other sectors such as waste and land management to look at greenhouse gas emission reductions. So with that, I'll go ahead and move to the next slide here. That is not a good sign. There's nothing on here. Why is that? Let's see if we can. Sorry about that.
You do have the thumb drive.
Let's try opening it again. There we go. I have no idea what that was. Okay. Okay, so I'll just quickly talk about the science of climate change and impact. So over the past century, I'm sure many of you hopefully have seen this image before, so I won't, and let me just say I'm not a scientist by training. My background is in sustainable development with a focus on energy and environment and not necessarily the meteorological science background. So over the past century, scientists have observed an increase in the average global temperature of 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature has been accompanied by disruptions in the atmospheric ocean systems, including increased frequency of severe weather events, such as the storms that we saw down in South and North Carolina, sea level rise, which we're seeing here in Connecticut already, and ocean acidification. These changes have in turn had many implications for natural ecosystems and the processes that humans depend on for survival. So while the Earth's climate has historically varied, as you can see over time, due to natural causes such as the changes in the sun's radiation, 97% of the scientific community is in agreement that changes observed since the Industrial Revolution, which is where that where the blue line starts, are anthropogenic or human caused. So since human-caused climate change has been correlated with increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, scientists attribute recent temperature changes to the greenhouse effect. Connecticut, as I mentioned previously, has already begun to experience adverse effects from climate change in the form of in changing ecosystems, and our infrastructure is can be in jeopardy. We had a few storms a couple years ago. I'm sure you remember Storm Sandy, and those are real damages and real costs. I do want to be careful about linking specific events to climate change, but we are beginning to see increasing levels of storms and the intensity of them, along with temperature intensities. So as winters become shorter and milder, tick and flea populations are predicted to rise, leading to more annual cases of vector-borne illnesses such as Lyme disease. Heavy rain events in communities utilizing combined sewer systems may cause combined sewer overflow, which may contaminate water and contribute to increase in gastrointestinal illness and infections. So climate change does pose a real serious threat to the environment, our economy, and to the health of citizens in Connecticut and around the world. So now I'm going to move a little bit about what is Connecticut's contribution to climate change, and where do we sit in terms of leadership in addressing it. So this slide, which I know is probably really hard to read all of those names, but essentially the outer circle is where emissions come from, meaning your electric sector, your transportation sector, your waste sectors. And then this inner circle is the middle circle is all of the states in the United States. So you can see the little yellow sliver is Connecticut's footprint. So relative to the rest of the United States, I think we're number 8, maybe even lower than that. Our footprint's pretty small. I mean, we're a small state. We're densely populated. We have one of the highest per capita emissions, lowest per capita emissions in the country. So relatively speaking, we're doing fine. However, it's really not at this point about our footprint. It's more about our leadership to take action. So Connecticut, has long been a leading state in taking strong action to respond to climate change. Policymakers, businesses, nonprofits, associations, municipalities, and individuals alike understand that a pathway to a low carbon future is not only possible, but also potentially profitable. As such, Connecticut is committed to leading the way by developing and demonstrating credible, scalable solutions. So this explicit demonstration helps galvanize and maintain the development of responses in the private sector, as well as jurisdictions around the world. So I really want to emphasize that much of the action that Connecticut has taken is not necessarily about reducing our own footprint. It's really about demonstrating policies and models that work, that can be replicated at a larger scale in other jurisdictions. So one such action is putting forward targets to reduce our emissions, and these are not aspirational targets. These are actually statutory targets. They're required by law. So in 2008, Connecticut passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which requires the state to reduce their emissions 10% below 1990 levels by 2020 and 80% below 2001 levels by 2050. Has anyone heard of the Global Warming Solutions Act? Mark is going to say, come on. Okay, so obviously a lot of people don't know about it, but it's an important backbone to ensuring that we actually take steps to reduce emissions and driving towards those emissions reductions. Then this past year, we've had a Governor's Council on Climate Change for the last 3 years, or since 2015, through Governor Malloy's executive order. And the council has been really looking at scenarios to ensure that we reach that 2050 target. So they recommended a 2030 target, so a midterm target of 45% below 2001 levels by 2030. And that was that recommendation was taken up by, well, it was a governor's bill and actually approved by the General Assembly this last session.
Are these reductions in CO2 alone or all greenhouse gases?
It's all greenhouse gases, but we convert everything to CO2 equivalent. So now we have another target in statute that we must achieve. And this is, none of these targets are easy, but the near-termness of this 45% reduction target is going to be tough. It's absolutely going to be tough to hit. So how are we doing? So as you can see, the red line is the actual emissions, the blue line is to the 2020 target, orange to the 2030, and green to the 2050. So that's a pretty steep slope from today's numbers down to 2050. As you can see, we had a rise up in emissions until about 2004, and then they declined dramatically from 2004 to about 2012 or 13. We've had a little bit of increase in the last couple of years. This is primarily due to weather. When you drill in on the data, it correlates with the weather as well as the numbers associated with heating. And we have some constraints in our electric generation fleet for fuel resources. So when that happens, you also see emissions that are higher from power plants because of those natural gas constraints. So you know, we are susceptible to the weather. It just kind of shows you the cyclical effect of climate change and increasing greenhouse gas emissions. We do know, though, that the data showing, the next year's data does show, if you remember, 2015, or the winter of 2014 and the winter of 2015 were pretty cold. And 2015 was that polar vortex that came down, and we had that really cold February, which I think is actually the coldest February in the last 30 years that the state has seen. So, you know, 2016 was much warmer, and so we are seeing a correlated reduction in emissions for 2016. We're halfway through the data analysis, and we assume that the numbers will actually be back down to the 2020 level because of that warm winter. But again, it just really emphasizes that we need to do more to hit these targets. The state has several different planning mechanisms to do more, but the land sector plays a big part. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the carbon sequestration and the role of forests and conservation. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the concept of carbon sequestration in our lands, trees, plants, and oceans. So I'll just do a quick review. This is a process by which atmospheric carbon dioxide is taken up by trees, grasses, and other plants through photosynthesis and stored as carbon in biomass, such as, you know, in tree trunks, branches, foliage, roots, and soils. The sink of carbon sequestration in forests and wood products helps to offset sources of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, such as deforestation, forest fires, and fossil fuel emissions. And globally, soils store 3 times the amount of carbon than above ground vegetation, forests, shrublands, and grasslands. So even small disturbances to soil can significantly increase carbon dioxide emissions. So you've probably heard about the permafrost coming unfrozen. There's carbon in that, and if that does defrost, then that carbon will be released into the air. So soils definitely play an important part in sequestering carbon. So I just wanted to share a few data sets and information. Feel free to you know, look further at these online. But the land use change and forestry sector represent an offset of 11.6% of total greenhouse gas emissions for the U.S. in 2016. So this is an enormous ecosystem service. So that's your green line down at the bottom. I mean, relative to energy, it is, you know, small, but it does play a role in ensuring that we will hit a U.S. target in 2050. So the main drivers for forest carbon sequestration include forest growth and increasing forest area, as well as net accumulation of carbon stocks and harvested wood pools. The primary drivers for fluxes on managed lands include forest management practices, tree planting in urban areas, the management of agricultural soils, landfilling of yard trimmings, food scraps, and activities that cause changes in carbon stocks in coastal wetlands. The other, so that image actually came from this report, which also has some data on Connecticut-specific sequestration numbers. So the EPA prepares this U.S. greenhouse gas emissions and sinks since the early 1990s. It's an annual report, and it provides a comprehensive accounting of total greenhouse gas emissions for all man-made sources in the United States. So the inventory includes all of the greenhouse gases in each sector, so your energy sector, your waste sector, your building sector, and your sinks. So it calculates the carbon dioxide emissions that are removed from the atmosphere by sinks through the uptake of carbon storage in forests, vegetation, and soils. So this information is actually submitted to the United Nations in accordance with the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the EPA consults scientists and experts across the United States to gather this information. It's a very comprehensive analysis. Oh, whoops. Okay. So I know it's probably a little difficult to notice the difference between those two, but there is a difference. And I will note that this data is available at Yukon Clear. If you haven't looked at their website, it's a fabulous resource. Very much encourage you to take a look. The point of this slide, though, is that between 1985 and 2010, Connecticut has lost 6.6% of its forested land and 15% of its agricultural lands. So there are many reasons why we want to stop or reverse this trend, but as highlighted in the previous slide, forests, soils, wetlands, and all sequester carbon. So for me in particular, this is a really critical piece of ensuring that we meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. We need these spaces to be managed well and to sequester as much carbon as possible. So I'm going to wrap up my presentation by talking about valuing natural and working lands. So I'll just read this slide. Conserving natural lands, working farms and forests, and the creation of trails and parks are often viewed in terms of their costs. Yet these often generate financial returns both to governments and individuals and create a significant cost savings to the government in the provision of services. It's a typo. Preservation projects can have a greater economic return than the money initially invested in the project. So we're talking about external return, or external costs and returns. So it's important to figure out how to value the carbon and other ecosystem services that these resources provide. We need them to filtrate our water. We need them to take carbon out of the air. We need them for species diversity. So putting an economic value to that can be helpful in convincing political leaders to invest in these resources. So actually, before I go in there, I also do want to mention carbon markets for offsets for either compliance markets, such as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or voluntary offsets, which is typically businesses who buy offsets to offset their emissions from sources that they can actually reduce. So I will mention it. I will caution about the applicability here in Connecticut. While a good idea, the cost to verify the carbon value, it can be expensive. And specifically for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the allowances price that you would have to beat is down around $3-4. So often by the time that you get the third-party verification and you do the investment to account for the carbon in the offset resource, you need more than $3 a ton. So it might be something that we can take advantage of in the future, but it's not something that I think is really ready right now. But the resources that are available to quantify and the tools that are available to quantify and put those into economic terms, I think actually they are available and should be used, because I think they're important for communicating the value of these resources. So that brings me to my last couple of slides. I want to bring your attention to these tools that were developed by the USDA and the U.S. Forest Service. Is anyone familiar with this website? Okay, It's the Climate Change Resource Center, and I did bring a handout, and I put them back on the table there. But it's just a website that you can access, and as you can see on those tabs, there's information for reading, research, tools, videos, links. You can educate yourself, understand current research, and opportunities to account for carbon in any projects that you might be involved in. So in the tool set they provide, I wanted to highlight the carbon estimation tools, a primer. The primer summarizes the most important factors to consider when deciding which estimation tool is appropriate for your needs. It provides you with information on assessing the scale, the required input data, accessibility and ease of use, and potential applications. Understanding this criteria will help inform your tool selection, because there are several tools. And I will say I'm not an expert in all of these. We have some folks over in our environmental conservation side that are familiar with some of these. But one thing that Amy and I have talked about is really providing more capacity building using these tools. And so, depending on what your needs are and what you're trying to quantify, the level of data that you need or need to input, these different tools might be a good fit for you. So as we, on that website, there's a description of each of the tools and gives you a quick summary of the data, scale, and outputs, and ease of use. I think ease of use is a really important one. No one wants to have to go back to school to learn how to use these tools. So I brought a handout, as I mentioned. Feel free to take one, go on the website, and hopefully in the future, the near-term future, we can better support using these tools and build capacity so you can quantify the economic benefits of these resources. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amy. She's going to talk a little bit more about some of the good conservation that's happening here in Connecticut.
Thanks, everybody. I'm assuming you can hear me okay in the back? Great. So, again, I'm Amy Blaymore Paterson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Land Conservation Council, or CLCC. CLCC is the umbrella organization for Connecticut's land conservation community, but we work most particularly with the state's land trusts. And I'll talk a little bit about our land trust community in a minute. My background, I was an attorney for over 20 years or so, focusing mostly on land use planning and environmental protection. I've worked both for federal government, local government, and even some state work as well. So I guess I've hit every level of government through my legal work. But I mostly enjoyed working with land trusts and groups that were seeking to conserve land in their community and act proactively, so that we wouldn't have to go to commission meetings in court to fight development that we thought would be threatening to the environment. And after doing that for over 20 years, I decided I wanted to, since I was basically acting as a nonprofit in my legal career, I said I might as well work for a nonprofit. And so I was offered the opportunity to go and work for the Trust for Public Land as a project manager in the New Haven office. It's a national organization that many of you probably are familiar with. And after working 2 years at TPL, I was offered this really unique and exciting opportunity to be the first executive director of the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. Very small organization, but we have a very important role in the state. And so I'm really honored to be here tonight and to talk about this subject of climate change for land trusts, which is something that is relatively new for me to be talking about, and new for our work, although as I will, if I think to advance these slides and not just talk all night, then I can get down into some of the reason why. So I just do the arrow to the right. So this is our mission statement here. We advocate for land conservation stewardship and funding and work to ensure the long-term strength and viability of land conservation in Connecticut. Like I said, we have a very important role to play in Connecticut, and that's because of all of you. We wear many hats. We provide training and education. We provide technical assistance. We are a convener of the land trusts and the organizations and individuals with whom they partner. And we really do believe that stronger together. And so we really try to foster collaboration as much as possible. And we also advocate on behalf of the community at the Capitol. I'm a lobbyist. We also have a contract lobbyist, and during the legislative session, I'm there every day. This summer, I had the honor of being part of the Connecticut team for the for the meeting of the U.S. Climate Alliance, the Natural and Working Lands Learning Lab. It was back in July, and the goal of the lab was to help states develop climate mitigation opportunities in the land sector. And really what that translated into was the states that, there were about 17 states in the country that said that despite the fact that the current administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, these states had pledged to move forward anyway. So it was a very exciting opportunity for CLCC, myself, to be a part of that conversation and really come to the table with the land trust community in mind. And that's us. And I will say for the record that Commissioner Rob Klee is standing on a step. And I am not. So we decided that there were a number of pathways for climate mitigation that we could choose. And as a team, we decided to go with avoided conversion, which is really land conservation, improved forest management, urban reforestation, and then when Kip Kolsinskis, who's the tall guy in back of me, representing the American Farmland Trust, many of you probably know Kip. He's a fixture in farmland preservation efforts here in Connecticut for years. He's fabulous. When he arrived, we also turned our attention to cropland nutrient management, mostly because neither Keri nor the Commissioner nor I really felt that we had the expertise to get down into the weeds, so to speak, on that topic. But it was really interesting. When Kip came, we were able to touch on that as well, and a little bit about tidal wetlands. But it was mostly the first three that we talked a lot about. So what I left that meeting with, and I have to say, I loved it. It was so exciting. It was I met with all these different states that, to be in the room and have that same feeling of commitment and passion for something that, despite what's going on down in DC on that topic, we're going to move ahead. It's inspiring. But what I came away with was, as I went down there thinking about land trusts, and I came away thinking about land trusts. And I thought, gee, what do our land trusts already do? Well, on top there, on the top line, this is when I go talk to groups about land trusts and their role in the community. These are the four umbrellas that I say our land trusts cover with their work. Underneath these umbrellas is what they do their work. They conserve, obviously. They protect land that they have conserved already. They advocate, or they should be advocating, and they connect. So thinking about, and we'll get into that, but thinking about those four roles and thinking about what I learned, I thought, well, gee, there is tremendous opportunity for our land trusts to be helping to mitigate climate change by doing nothing more than what they're doing already, and then some. So there's our mission statement for what's a land trust. It's a private nonprofit organization whose central mission is actively conserving land by either taking title to the land or holding easements. How many of you in this room are either on a board or a volunteer or otherwise associated with a land trust? Okay, so I would say maybe a little more than half. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about tonight about what land trusts are doing and what they can be doing is really applicable to everybody in this room, whether you are an active member of a land trust or not. You can be doing the things that I'm going to be talking about every day, particularly in that last topic about connecting people. Oops, where am I? There we go. Oh, and the one thing I just want to say that I like to emphasize every time I talk about land trusts is that their mission, unlike pretty much any other nonprofit that I could think of, is to last forever. It's perpetuity. It's all about saving land and all of the effects that has, the impacts that has forever. So I came back and I thought, well, why would the land trust consider working to slow down climate change? We know what the mission is. Why do they need to worry about it? Well, why wouldn't they? When we're talking about land and we're talking about climate change, everything that we are seeing with the impacts of climate change that Keri just alluded to and discussed in her presentation impacts land conservation, land trust's mission. It goes to undermining the health and welfare of the land that they have protected. So it undermines conservation mission. It undermines their pledge to conserve land in perpetuity. It undermines the places that they are trying to connect people to use and enjoy. And when I got involved with land conservation work, it was development that was seen as the key driver to undermining a land trust's mission. Now it's climate change. The changes that we're seeing in our atmosphere are directly impacting the health of the land that these land trusts are working really hard to conserve. And there's a sense of urgency. The window is closing. The window for any meaningful change is closing. It's not just a coastal problem, it's everywhere. And long-term conservation is that commitment to long-term conservation is what we need to be doing in order to help make the changes that are needed to help offset the impacts of climate change. So what can land trusts do? I love that picture, so I want to just sit here for a second. Look at it. So going back to how I felt when I came back from DC, I really believe that if we infuse climate change into everything that you're already doing as a land trust or as folks that support your local land trust, then you are going to be helping to make a change. You will be working towards climate mitigation. Looking at those 4 umbrellas again: conserve, protect, advocate, connect. So let's look at them together. Land trusts conserve land. That's in every mission. That's inherent in what they do. They acquire land and they hold easements. And if you have questions, by the way, about either of our talks, but some of the terms, whether conservation easements, whatever, please hold on to those, and we'll talk about that at the end. We have plenty of time, I understand, for questions and answers. So if there's anything in here that I'm talking about that you'd like to talk about a little bit more, we'll have a chance to do that. So I have some quotes here that I think are really worth actually reading rather than trying to paraphrase. And the first one is from the Nature Conservancy, and Keri talked about this, about trees. Trees capture carbon from the carbon dioxide in the air as they produce oxygen. An acre of mature forest can capture more than a metric ton of carbon every year. Forests, prairies, farmland, and other natural habitats absorb approximately 15% of the U.S.'s carbon dioxide emissions. That's a huge benefit, but one that we stand to lose if, that's a typo, if we keep converting open land for development, and that's from the Land Trust Alliance. And I've got a couple of resources for you, some websites that you can look at as well, that I'll rattle off the link at the end. So knowing that land conservation can have that impact on climate change mitigation, let's look back at Connecticut again. We've got 137 plus or minus land trusts in the state. That's the 3rd most per state in the country. And no matter what the census says, whether that goes down or whether that number goes up, depending upon who's responded and how we define land trusts, we are staying steady at the 3rd most land trusts in the country. And that's a good thing. It could be a challenging thing, but that's a very good thing, because if we're conserving a lot of land, that's going to help offset some of the impacts of climate change. In Connecticut, we've conserved over 190,000 acres through our land trust community, and I say likely an underestimate. It is an underestimate. It absolutely is. There's a lot of underreporting. We're not capturing a lot of the work that the land trusts in Connecticut are doing. I looked at the Simsbury Land Trust as our prime example here of the type of land that they're focusing on when conserving, or when focusing their conservation efforts. Fields and farms, ridges, wetlands, and scenic vistas, and this photo is from their website. And so I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. Wetlands is a really important part of land conservation efforts in Connecticut especially, and I have a couple of quotes here, but wetlands are critically important as carbon sinks. This picture is of beaver ledges, which was recently conserved by the Haddam Land Trust down in the lower Connecticut River Valley. Farms, fields, and grasslands. Conserving farmland by acre and soil by the inch is a powerful strategy for reducing greenhouse gases and improving productivity. Farmers and ranches can help reverse climate change by drawing down carbon from the air through practices that sequester carbon in the soil. So that quote is actually a combination of both why it's important to acquire the land and conserve it, and also to take care of it and manage it in a way that is going to enhance its ability to sequester carbon. And that's from the American Farmland Trust. That picture is of the Trout Brook Valley Preserve, which was conserved by the Aspetuck Land Trust in Easton. And it is a combination of forest, fields, and actually a blueberry orchard as well. So we have conservation as our first umbrella. Now let's look at land protection. I took that photo of that butterfly right in my backyard as a backyard habitat area. Stewardship, management, preservation. Once a land trust acquires the land, the hard part really begins, and that's all about properly stewarding the land and managing it to make sure that the conservation values that they are seeking to protect by acquiring the land are not only protected, but enhanced, and managing the property to make sure that they are doing the things that are necessary for that enhancement. When we were down in Washington, D.C., we rattled off a whole bunch of topics under mitigation. And we had reforestation, urban forestry, habitat restoration enhancement, natural forest management, invasives control, agricultural land management, improved soil health and nutrient management, coastal and tidal wetlands restoration, and living shorelines. I am not a scientist, I'm a lawyer. But I will tell you that when land trusts acquire land, like I said, then the hard part begins. And each of these topics has a science attached to it that I would encourage you to look further into if you are, as part of a land trust, looking at best management practices for your property. I'm going to examine just a couple of them with you or go through some examples, but there's just so much to learn, and it's very exciting because that to me just equals potential. I thought this was a very interesting example. KESTRAL Land Trust in Massachusetts was fortunate to get a fund dedicated for conserving their forests as forever wild. And remember I had said in one of my first slides about mature forests, an acre of mature forest can capture more than a metric ton of carbon every year. So this was a land trust with two landowners that recognized the value of old growth forests, and with this gift they were able to create a dedicated fund to conserve the forest as forever wild. So this was not only a conservation opportunity, but this was also a protection opportunity and a management opportunity. So they're managing only to remove invasive species, control insects or pathogens, and create hiking trails. So this was one of those examples where taking trees down was not part of that management plan, was not part of that philosophy. And preservation is one of the mitigation avenues that we discussed down in Washington, D.C. Grasslands, the same thing. This is a same thing, in other words, that managing these grasslands, making sure that they are taken care of in a way that is going to enhance the conservation value of grassland is critically important. Just conserving the grassland as is and then doing nothing to manage it and enhance its conservation values is not going to achieve that goal. So there's some stats for you there about the mitigation potential of grassland systems. This is a grassland area in Pomfret, Connecticut. It is conserved by the Connecticut Audubon Society in partnership with the Wyndham Land Trust. And then urban forestry was another pathway that we looked at. And again, it's not only about acquiring the land, but it's also what are you doing to the land to help mitigate the impacts of climate change. And I really love this example. The Knox Foundation in Hartford, they have this Trees for Hartford Neighborhoods, and they basically do tree planting from block to block. And some of the benefits of the trees include filtering pollutant gases out of the air, oxygen production, stormwater retention, urban heat island reduction. The third umbrella that we talked about, so we have conservation, we have protection, and now we have advocacy. It is a huge part of what we do at CLCC, and it should be a huge part of what every land trust in Connecticut is doing as well. We're all part of the solution, and that's a message that we need to send every day to our elected officials. On the right, you'll see just these are the focus points of our annual conservation agenda. This came from 2018. The Community Investment Act is a critically important source of funding that provides money for the open space grant program, as does bonding. Public lands protection, and this is my segue to this, I don't want to forget, that on November 6th, you have an opportunity to support a ballot initiative. This is the first statewide ballot initiative for the environment, and this would be a question that would, if approved, would put in place a process that would better protect our public lands. It would add transparency to a process that right now is flawed because it enables the legislature to sell, transfer, otherwise convey land at the very end of the session without any public knowledge or input. This would add transparency to that process so that you would know whether or not a piece of land that belongs to the state in your community is going to be transferred and have an opportunity to comment on that. And we can talk more about that at the end. Other funding options, we have been seeking to try and get towns the opportunity to set up their own funding sources. We work hard to protect watershed lands, and we also work to advocate for the funding for farmland preservation programs. And why is that so important? Because you need the resources to be able to go out and avoid conversion, to go ahead and take that first pathway and put it to work. You need the resources to be able to conserve land. So we work hard to protect those resources, and the only way that we can be successful is working with the land trusts across the state to send those messages about how important that is. This picture here is of the, actually this is the Trout Brook Valley Preserve that I showed you before through the drone picture. We hosted 7 visits around the state this summer, showcasing properties that had been conserved through the Open Space Grant Program, the Open Space and Watershed Land Acquisition Grant Program, which again is funded through those sources that we are trying very hard to protect. 7 legislators came out and they all pledged their support for those programs as a result of being on that site, a conserved site, and seeing the impact that that's having on their community. And it's pretty powerful, and you're a part of that. So land trusts can lobby. You can also certainly answer questions about that, but you absolutely can lobby. This was one, this is something that's kind of interesting, and I just wanted to bring it to your attention because you think about lobbying, and I just rattled off a whole bunch of state programs, but you need to think about local zoning and local issues here at home that impact land conservation as well, and that will then help to enhance your work to offset climate change. And so this example was Scenic Hudson in New York. It's a regional land trust that works to combat, this land trust works to combat climate change by putting in place guidelines for building clean energy. And what struck me about this is that these are really about smart growth type of concepts. And in Connecticut, we do have a siting council, which makes local zoning a little bit trickier to deal, to use as your tool. But I thought that these were really, and just take a minute to look at them, these are really common sense zoning principles that help with siting so that you can strike that balance between the siting of renewable energy infrastructure and conserving land, because that has been a bit of a rub both at the Capitol and locally. And they did this and they've had a lot of success with it. And then the last umbrella that we talked about is connecting people to nature. That's maybe the most important role of a land trust. And so how can you use that role of connecting people to land with helping to offset the impacts of climate change? And that really goes to communications. Communicating about climate change, I love this slide. I got this from, I want to tell you that I want to credit Judy Anderson from Community Consultants. She's a National Land Trust consultant. She works a lot in Connecticut. She helps CLCC out quite a bit. She did a long talk on this, much longer than what we would have time for tonight. But I did borrow some of her slides, and I wanted to give her credit for that. And she shared this one for me, and I just love this because it's really about just talking about it. It's not about any you can get really bogged down in the science, particularly around mitigation. But if you start with just talking about climate change and making this part of the conversation of your land trust work, no matter what you're doing, it will take you one step further to helping to mitigate those impacts. Linking it to local, making sure you're talking about local food and water, local habitat, local recreation, all the things that I spoke about earlier, making sure that that's part of your conversation, that climate change will impact the land trust mission and it will impact all of the things locally that are important to your residents. Again, infusing climate change into what you already do. For those of you that are representing land trusts, all your outreach, your programming, your work planning, your land protection, bringing climate change into the fold in everything you do will help move it forward. When you walk, when you organize your walks and your hikes, you make it real. You talk about it. You bring in people to relate what they're seeing, what people are seeing on the ground to the impacts of climate change. Organizing community conversations just like this. And I'm going to kind of roll quickly now because these are tips, but I will tell you the numbers aren't going to make sense because I didn't pull all of her tips out of her slides, too many of them. Citizen science. I mean, I know that Simsbury Land Trust has terrific education and outreach programs. And like I said, this is just one of them. But when you're out on the ground and you're working, you're already doing this work. You can get the assistance that you need through experts, through resources, and start to integrate the concepts of climate change into everything that you're doing with your citizen science programs. Using social media to build appreciation, share good news, share interesting. It doesn't always have to be bad news, and there's good news happening around the country when it comes to climate change. So we should be sharing that. I like this one, the trails as alternative transportation. It made me think of the Wittenberry Land Trust in Bloomfield, not far from here. They conserved Hawk Hill Farm, and then they were able to build a trail system that connected the farm to the downtown area. And thinking about it and talking about it as a transportation hub as opposed to just a trail starts to, again, bring in the conversation of decreasing the impacts of climate change. Again, using your e-newsletters, make them visual. Sharing good news, I guess that's a duplicate, sorry. Sharing partner materials, making sure that when you see something out there that's relevant to climate change and the work that you're doing, you're sharing it. Providing tips that add value. If you are doing something on one of your preserves, when you bring people out for a hike on the trail, take a second, show them some of the work that you're doing that's actually helping to impact, mitigate climate change. Again, rain barrels, that's something that a lot of the land trusts I know are using on some of their properties, but I don't know if they're really talking about it. It's all about really talking about the work that you're doing now and how that can help and putting that in a different light. Your website, demonstration projects, promoting other programs, creating, this was an interesting one for me, creating a climate action plan. The Trustees of Reservation is up in Massachusetts. I think they're the first land trust in the country. And they created a climate action plan. And I would say to all land trusts, challenge yourself to take that step and start by just having a conversation. What is your land trust climate action plan? When you're thinking about strategic conservation planning, how can you integrate climate into that conversation? Finding new partners and shared values. This one was coordinating with a religious organization. I thought this was interesting too. If your land trust does have investments, it's taking a look at them and seeing if there's a way to divest from fossil fuels in your endowments and your organizational funds. And in closing, land trusts are the ones thinking about proper relationship between humans and the earth. If land trusts are not thinking about this, if land trusts are not having these conversations and just talking about it, then who will? You are the closest to the ground. You're the ones that are saving the places that are so special in your community. It is really not difficult to relate the important work that you're doing with offsetting the impacts of climate change. Perpetuity, again, it comes back to your mission. You do have a choice. We're looking at saving thousands of species, our way of life, our local food, our water, health. Conservation is depending on your leadership. This is a readiness chart. As you can tell, I'm kind of writing down, but I thought this was a really interesting one because I think to me, it kind of takes the pressure off of the land trusts. When I'm out talking to land trusts, you know, many of them are really challenged with a lack of staff, if any, just their capacity to get things done. And when you start to talk about climate change or something else, it might seem daunting to them. Like, this is a new program. I don't know if I can take on another program. And again, by just bringing climate change into the fold of what you're already doing, it kind of takes that pressure off. But this was kind of a nice continuum about how ready you are to start implementing some things. Going from just starting with discussing it, bringing in some readings, all the way up to changing your conservation easement to make sure that it is including provisions that will allow renewable energy infrastructure. 100 years from now, looking back, the only question that will appear important about the historical moment in which we now live is the question of whether or not we did anything to arrest climate change. That's not me, that's from The Economist, and that's actually a quote that Judy Anderson gave to me, but it really did resonate because I do believe that that all goes to Land Trust's mission for perpetuity. We're going to be around, the work that you do is around forever if we do it right. And so bringing climate change into the work that you're doing now will really help to ensure that that mission and that work is met. So thank you, and happy to answer questions.
And I forgot to hand you this.
Oh, I'll start all over again now. So, questions? Questions. You know, I spoke to Amy, I said, you know, we are talking about very different things. It's a lot of science and a lot of policy. So hopefully you will have retained all of that enough that you have some questions.
I guess it's for Keri. How will the sweep of the energy efficiency fund money into the general fund affect meeting the targets, statutory targets for reducing?
Sure. I mean, obviously, that's not helpful. Commissioner Klee, my commissioner, has made that very clear. You know, we will continue to, and you know, they didn't take all the money. There's still some money. The Green Bank still has some money. Our Energy Efficiency Board still has money. But yeah, it will decrease the number of energy efficiency projects that can be done, you know, over the next fiscal year. I will say the RGGI dollars, they're taking some of those funds as well, but good news, the last auction, the allowances were up in price, so we are actually already have paid off the sweep for the RGGI dollars, so that's helpful. But you know, it's important that we communicate to legislators as well why these things are important, not only for conservation, but you know, those are your dollars that came out of, you know, money you spent on energy or on your energy consumption that's supposed to go back to you. So I don't want to not emphasize enough that communicating to your legislators what's important and why it's important, it goes a long way to the decisions that they make that will impact us into the future. Other questions?
This is a Keri question as well. When the Deepwater Wind Solar Farm that's going in Simsbury comes online, because that's a joint project of several states, how will the offset of carbon emissions by using that solar instead of fossil fuel be accounted for?
So I wasn't here when that project was, I'll just say I'm not involved in that one, but the way that the contracts work is you have to buy both the renewable energy credits and or the energy. You don't get credit for the carbon reduction if you don't buy the renewable energy credits associated with those projects. So I don't know that project specifically of which state is buying the credits associated with that, or if it's the utilities, or the utilities get the credits on behalf of ratepayers and sell them for different credits. I don't know the details of that, but that's essentially how it works. Whoever purchases the renewable energy credits associated with the generation gets the credit. But moving forward, that is one of our strategies to ensure that we do hit these targets, is additional procurements. We just announced a wind procurement over the summer. We just actually took in over 100 bids for zero carbon resources this past Friday, and we will continue to do more procurements. You know, both, you know, behind the meter, well, probably not procurements, but behind the meter will play a piece of the portfolio, as well as you know, the larger scale projects. So sorry, I don't have the details, but it's essentially purchase based. Any other questions?
I was a little surprised to see you talk about using land trust lands for clean energy, and I thought that was sort of off limits. But are there examples that you're aware of lands that have been conserved and preserved, but also being used for clean energy?
Well, just by conserving the land, it is helping to create clean energy. Just by that's really the first category of land conservation. You can do nothing with the land, and in fact, in some cases, it's most appropriate to do nothing and have them as old-growth forests and forever wild. But there are examples of land trusts around the country, not necessarily in Connecticut, that I can think of right off the top of my head, that are conserved lands that they have either partnered with solar energy companies, not necessarily to place the infrastructure on the property, but a partnership in that the company will donate money towards land conservation. You know, they have a partnership that way. But in terms of placing infrastructure, there are examples across the country where it is being done. And it's being done in a way that is both allowing the conserved values to stay protected, so it's not doing anything to compromise that, but also allow for the infrastructure. But in Connecticut, I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head where we have conserved lands that are actively being used for, I do know of private properties certainly where that's happening, as I'm sure you do too, but not land trusts. But the point was, again, about conserving land in and of itself is a way to offset the impacts of climate change.
And one thing, you know, and this has been a very controversial topic in the state over the last couple of years, is, you know, agricultural lands being displaced and forests being displaced with solar PV large-scale installations. So I think it's a really important topic to continue to talk about. I think quantification of the carbon reductions associated with those spaces as compared to the solar generation output, these are tools that will help move those conversations and help evaluate the comparison between the two types of resources, whether it's a generation resource or whether it's a carbon sink resource. So those are things that we're certainly looking at as we go out and procure energy resources. We're working closely with our counterparts at DEEP on the conservation side to look at tools like this to ensure that we're really evaluating the costs and the benefits of losing these spaces.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that as well. The Council on Environmental Quality here in Connecticut did a terrific report in 2017. It's the special report on energy sprawl in Connecticut, and it goes right to that point because the way our system was set up in the state is that it was incentivizing the use of open land, whether it be farmland or forest land, for energy infrastructure projects. And it was not creating those same types of incentives for others. And this is where that scenic Hudson model is really interesting because they look to incentivize land that can be reused. So brownfields, landfills that have been covered for energy infrastructure projects as opposed to using what would be the lesser expensive option of using open land for energy infrastructure projects. And over the last two sessions, there have been a couple of bills, as Keri alluded to, and CLCC has submitted testimony related to both of them. And in 2017, and this bill didn't go anywhere, but this one was, I mean, it went somewhere, but it didn't get passed, and that was an act to restrict the use of incentives for the development of solar arrays on agricultural land, and it was exactly for that purpose. And to your question, and this is what I was saying, is that the problem is not with land trust lands. The problem is with open lands that have not yet been protected. And so this is land that's available for purchase and for development. And so the CEQ was saying that the incentives that we have in place right now are moving developers towards looking at those lands, those open lands, as opposed to lands that could be reused. And so legislation is being considered. In 2018, a bill was passed, SB 943, and this was an act concerning the installation of certain solar facilities on productive farmlands, and that goes to what Keri was talking about making sure that the commissioner has the ability to take into account the environmental impacts of these on these lands before they are consumed. Yes, there was a question, sorry.
Oh, well, I would assume that Vermont, with having solar farms every 2 inches, has data on it.
I don't know of anyone, at least out in the east, looking at the carbon sequestration you're foregoing when you clear cut or use agricultural spaces that are holding carbon in the soil as compared to the energy output and the associated emissions reductions.
Oh, is Vermont just using like already, what do they do? I mean.
I don't think that they're looking at it. I
don't?
don't think they're quantifying it, no.
It's hard to, wow, that's amazing.
Because it can be hard to quantify, and it has not,
They're so gung-ho about it, you'd think that they would have the reasons. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with Vermont's policies, but I think the topic of large-scale renewables displacing forests, it is fairly new. I mean, now we're seeing the proliferation of more and more large-scale renewable, and it will continue to be an issue. So we really need to continue to have these conversations and figure out, laws like prohibiting siting of renewable energy technologies on agriculture. That's not really helpful. I mean, we got to be careful that we're not incentivizing some other type of development on those lands.
Right.
So it's really about a balanced approach.
The other question I had, did you sort of infer that, like, colleges that strive to be carbon neutral, like Middlebury, Vermont, and I don't know what Connecticut is doing, it may not, like, were you saying?
On the offsets?
There with the offsets. You're saying something about $3 a ton.
So if you want to look at the carbon benefits of a forest, for instance, there are protocols and compliance markets that you can sell. You can create your carbon offset and sell those into carbon markets. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a regional carbon reduction program across many states that curb emissions in with our power plants. So one of the ways that you can curb emissions at your power plants is actually by buying offsets. The offsets need to be less expensive than the allowances that you can also buy. So when the allowances are down at $30 a ton and your carbon offsets cost $10 a ton, you're not going to buy carbon offsets. So that my point is you just have to be careful about going down that path, because it is a little bit of an expensive path to get the verification and meet all the protocols associated with creating a real, true carbon offset. That's what I was saying.
I have a question about the solar complex that's going to be going in Simsbury. Is it correct that has a limited, it has an end life?
I know the contract probably is 15 to 20 years. I don't know enough about that project.
I remembered reading that at the end of that contract, then it could be dismantled and the land would be going back.
Do you know? Yeah, I just don't know enough about that project. Oh, okay.
Well, I'm not sure I know the details, but the plan is that if the company wants to dismantle at that point, the land could go back. It's really hard to determine in 20 years what kind of need there's going to be for solar or how many acres of solar. So it's just a possibility.
Yeah, the contracts that we sign or that we have the utility sign on your behalf are usually 15 to 20 years. That's the amount of time that they need to pay for the investment. So once that contract is up, then they can do whatever they want, or if they have a lease. It depends on the lease of the land, if they own the land, etc. But typically, you continue to generate energy from those sources until the panels no longer work, which you're seeing some longevity with the panels much further or much longer than I think originally anticipated back in the 70s when solar was just getting started.
Tom.
For Amy, kind of a political question. My representative says, I support the environment. And all that. So I checked out what his voting record was on the thing that's going to be on the ballot.
On question number 2?
Yeah, question.
Okay.
He voted against it.
He must have been in the House of Representatives because it
Yes.
passed unanimously in the Senate.
Right. So how do I keep track, if I don't know the exact, is there any way of finding out who's good environmentally and specific, or how, is there any?
Conservation voters?
Or do I have to know the number of every bill that's there, or?
There's a lot to follow, so.
There is, and I would say, Tom, throughout the session, when we send out alerts on certain, whether it be about the budget or whether it be a certain piece of legislation that's critical to our work in land conservation, you can follow those bills, and there's a much smaller amount of work to do in that regard than if you're looking at it in a broader way. The League of Conservation Voters does have a scorecard that they put out. They just recently put out their scorecard that they score the environmental record, the voting record of different legislators from the past session, and that's helpful for some people to look at that as well. But I really believe that developing a relationship with your legislator and understanding why they are voting the way why they voted the way they did, and getting to know them through the session. I think hosting visits at your land trust's property, you have beautiful properties. You should be celebrating them. Bring them out, and then they will see, like that photo where we had 7 legislators coming, and every one of them, after seeing that, and maybe that wasn't the reason why, but every one of them pledged their support for the Community Investment Act and the Open Space Grant Program because they saw a piece of property that was benefiting their community. So I think it's just developing that relationship, and there are some tools out there to help you look at voting records, but just stay in touch. And I will say, about this question number 2, the ballot initiative, what happened back in the legislature is irrelevant now. If a legislator voted against it then, that doesn't matter. It's on the ballot, and that's what matters. It's moving it forward, and really questioning why they might have voted. There are so many reasons why a legislator might have voted a certain way at that moment in time during the legislative session at the very end. So we don't care about that now. We're just happy it's on the ballot and that we're going to get this across the finish line.
And I just want to say, educate your legislators. They have a lot on their plate. They're not the experts in most of the topics that they deal with. So educate them, let them know the information they don't know.
Along those lines, somebody came to my door, was running against this person. I said, what do you think of question number 2? He didn't know anything about it. So just by asking, asking him, it made him aware of it, and he said, it sounds good, I'll look into it. So it's a good thing to bring up. If some new guy in the block is trying to run.
And equally important is to educate your neighbors, more, just as much with the legislator, because this is a bipartisan ballot initiative. We had support from both sides, and so moving forward, it's really about educating the people in your community. Once people know about this, they think, oh yeah, this is a terrific idea. It's just making sure that they know about it. So there are some of these cards in the back. Please help yourself, and if you want more, contact me. We'll get you more.
Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.